The air was thick with the sound of train whistles and final goodbyes. At King's Cross Station, a young pilot named Arthur Bell held his wife Emily close, knowing this could be their last embrace. What he didn't know, what she hadn't told him, was that a new life had already begun growing inside her. Hidden beneath her wool coat, a quiet hope. Arthur was a pilot for the Royal Air Force, heading to war with nothing but courage, and a photo Emily had slipped into his hands. On the back, just 4 words: "Come back to us." The train pulled away. Her hand trembled in the air. Her voice, soft and breaking, whispered, "We'll be waiting." From that day on, letters became lifelines. Every week, a piece of Arthur's heart arrived in her mailbox, filled with memories, dreams, and the quiet fear that not every goodbye comes with a return. This is not just a story about war. It's a story about love, sacrifice, and the silent promises made on platforms and battlefields, promises that echo through time. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. It was the spring of 1944, and the winds over southern England carried more than just the scent of blooming fields. They carried the weight of what was to come. At a modest airbase nestled between farmlands and hedgerows, Flight Lieutenant Arthur Collins stood beside his aircraft, a quiet strength in his posture. He was young, just 32, but his eyes had seen more than most men ever should. Arthur led his squadron with a steady hand and a heart full of duty. Every mission left a mark, a memory he couldn't shake, but he never spoke of that. Not to Emily. Emily was his light, the reason he smiled when the engines roared to life, the face he saw when the clouds parted. They had promised each other a quiet life once the war was over, perhaps a cottage by the sea and a garden full of wildflowers. Each night before sleep stole what little peace he had, Arthur wrote to her. He never mentioned the close calls, the smoke in the sky, or the silence that followed a friend's plane not returning. Instead, he told stories about the stars they'd named together, or the birds that flew alongside his Spitfire at dawn. In one letter, dated May 28th, he wrote something that Emily would never forget. "If one day my wings stop flying, just look up. Think of me as part of the sky, always watching over you." The days grew heavier as June approached. Everyone knew something big was coming. The base buzzed with coded briefings and loaded silence. Arthur's squadron was chosen for a mission crucial to the landings ahead, clearing the path for thousands of soldiers preparing to cross into Normandy. He didn't say goodbye, not in the way that sounded final. He simply said he'd write soon. June 5th, 1944. The mission began before sunrise. As the planes soared toward the French coast, Arthur felt a strange calm. Below, the fields of Normandy stretched out like a patchwork quilt, hiding secrets beneath their soil. Somewhere near Saint-Lô, enemy fire lit up the sky. Arthur's aircraft was seen taking a direct hit. The formation scattered. Radio contact was lost. Back at the base, his name never came through on the returning list. For days there was silence. No wreckage, no signals, just absence. A week later, a letter arrived in Emily's hands, its edges worn, the ink slightly smudged. It had traveled slowly through war-torn routes, unaware of the message that had already reached her. Arthur was missing, presumed lost. She opened it on her porch where they once sat planning names for their future children. The handwriting was unmistakably his, calm, gentle. He spoke of the moonlight that reminded him of her smile, of the peace he found in the clouds. And at the end, the same line echoed, "If I don't make it back, don't think of me as gone. Just look to the sky, that's where I'll be." Emily fell to her knees, the letter clutched against her heart. The sun was setting, casting soft gold over the garden. She looked up, tears blurring the horizon, and whispered his name. Years passed. Normandy healed. The world moved forward. But Emily never stopped watching the sky. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled the trees or a shadow passed across the moon, she believed he was near, not lost, just part of the heavens. And that belief, that quiet hope, became her strength. Arthur Collins never returned from Normandy, but his story remained, in every letter, in every life he helped protect, and in the heart of the woman who never let him fade into silence. He became more than a name on a wall. He became a whisper in the clouds, a soft echo above Normandy. December 1944 arrived with cold winds and quiet streets as the world remained tangled in the long shadow of war. Amid the uncertainty and aching silence, a soft cry echoed through a small countryside home in southern England. Emily had given birth to a daughter, Lily. She was beautiful, delicate, and when Emily looked into her eyes, time stood still. They were his, Arthur's, the same deep, thoughtful gaze that once searched the skies. It was as if a piece of him had returned to her, carried gently in the soul of their child. The nurses whispered kind words, neighbors brought bread and blankets, but no amount of comfort could fill the space beside Emily's bed, the space where Arthur should have stood, smiling, holding her hand, whispering promises of a future they'd once dreamed of. She never allowed grief to harden her. Instead, she turned it into quiet strength. She kept Arthur's letters in a wooden box carved by his own hands, their corners worn from years of rereading. Each night, she held Lily close and read them aloud, her voice a soft bridge between past and present. "My darling Emily." The letters would begin, and for a few moments he was in there again. While others moved on, remarried and rebuilt their lives, Emily waited, not with bitterness but with a heart full of quiet hope. Her friends worried. Some called her foolish, others gently urged her to accept what the world had already decided. But Emily would just smile, brush her daughter's hair aside and say, "True love doesn't need proof to be real. It lives in the waiting, in the faith, in the moments we carry in silence." Lily grew up hearing stories of a man who flew through the clouds, whose voice lived in ink and paper, and whose heart still beat in the rhythm of the wind outside their window. She believed not because someone told her to, but because her mother's love made it feel real. Emily taught her not to chase closure, but to honor memory, not to fear absence, but to fill it with meaning. And so through the cold winters and quiet birthdays, through war's end and peace's return, one thing never changed. Emily never closed the box, never stopped reading the letters, never stopped looking to the sky, because in every sunrise and every breeze, in Lily's smile and in the hush of night, Arthur was still there, watching, waiting, and most of all, loved. The war was drawing to a close, but its wounds still ran deep across Europe. In the spring of 1945, as the fields around Caen began to bloom again, a quiet desperation lingered in the air. In a makeshift military hospital on the outskirts of the city, nurses moved swiftly between rows of cots, tending to those left behind by the chaos. That's where they brought him. He had been found near the remnants of a downed aircraft, his uniform torn, his face partially hidden beneath burns and bruises. No identification, no memory, no words that made sense at first, just silence and pain. The staff called him Jacques, a placeholder name for a man without a past. He didn't speak much, except in fevered murmurs late at night, and when he did, his voice trembled in English, not French. He spoke of skies and falling metal, of fire and cold, and sometimes barely above a whisper he said a name, Emily. Nurse Helene Moreau had seen many soldiers come and go, their stories ending before they could be told. But there was something different about this man. Something in his gaze, distant, hollow, yet searching, as if part of him refused to disappear. Helene had lost her brother in the early days of the invasion. Since then, she had carried her grief like a quiet scar beneath her uniform. But with Jacques, she felt something stir, an unspoken connection. Perhaps it was his confusion or the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. Perhaps it was the way he tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. She began to sit by his bedside longer than required, bringing him tea, reading to him, humming old songs from home. And little by little she saw glimpses of the man he used to be. He flinched at the sound of airplanes. He wept in his sleep. And once, while she was adjusting his blanket, he looked up at her with sudden clarity and asked, "Is she safe?" "Who?" she asked softly. He blinked, and the moment passed. But she didn't forget. Every time he said Emily, Helene wrote it down. She searched reports, questioned other patients, even asked British officers passing through if they'd known a man who had gone missing, perhaps a pilot. No answers came, just fragments, bits of memory lost in the wind. But Helene never gave up, not because she was bound by duty, but because she believed that every soul deserved to be known, remembered, loved. She didn't know who he truly was, not yet. But in the quiet hours, when the world outside fell still, she'd hold his hand and promise, "You are not forgotten. Someone, somewhere, is waiting for you." And though he couldn't remember his name, part of him, buried deep beneath the scars, believed her. Because even in broken minds, love has a way of surviving. Even in silence, echoes remain. Rain tapped softly on the canvas roof of the field hospital. Outside, the grey skies mirrored the mood within, quiet, uncertain, waiting. Inside one of the smaller wards, Nurse Helene Moreau sat by the window, a book in her lap and a pen in her hand. Every day she documented the slow, fragile progress of the man they still called Jacques. She had come to know his silences, his flickers of emotion, the way his eyes searched the horizon through the open flap of the tent. He rarely spoke, but he listened. So she filled the air for him with stories of home, news from the front, and verses from poetry that softened the edges of the world. She treated him with care that went beyond duty, guided not by orders, but by a quiet sense that this man had once belonged to someone, somewhere. One rainy afternoon, as she was changing his sheets and folding his uniform, her hand brushed against something hidden deep in the lining of his coat. She reached in and pulled out a small, tarnished button, golden with a faded crest. She recognized it at once, the Royal Air Force. Her heart skipped. This wasn't just any wounded man. He had flown. He had worn wings. That night, by candlelight, Helene wrote letters to British air bases and Red Cross officials, describing the man with no name, the button, the dreams, the word Emily that sometimes escaped his lips like a ghost slipping through fog. She mailed them all, not knowing if any would ever reach the right hands. Days passed, still no replies. But she kept showing up, reading to him, humming old tunes, brushing his hair with quiet care. Then, one evening, as the rain returned and the scent of damp earth filled the room, she read a poem aloud. It was simple, about waiting, about a promise made under the stars, about believing in return even when the world says otherwise. As the final line left her lips, "I will come back, I promise." She noticed his breath catch. A tear slid down his cheek. Then another. He didn't sob. He didn't speak. But his eyes, those eyes, filled with skies and sorrow, closed slowly, as if he were hearing something he hadn't heard in a long time. A memory, perhaps. A voice. Helene leaned in and gently placed her hand over his. "You're not lost," she whispered. "Someone out there is waiting." And in that moment, for the first time since he had arrived, broken and nameless, he squeezed her hand back. Something was waking inside him. A promise, a name, a sky he had once called home. Summer draped the English countryside in soft gold. But inside Emily's home, a quiet storm stirred. It had been over a year since Arthur vanished into the skies above Normandy, and though the world around her had begun to rebuild, new lives, new roads, new beginnings, Emily still walked through each day with a gentle ache in her chest. In her bedroom, tucked beneath folded linens, rested a wooden box carved with Arthur's initials. Inside, dozens of letters slept in silence, each one a piece of him, his voice, his heart, his hopes. She had read them. So many times she could whisper every word by memory. One morning, moved by a strange mix of longing and resolve, Emily placed the box on her lap and opened it slowly. Her hands trembled. She had heard of a war memorial being built in London, a place to honor those who never came home. Part of her wanted to give the letters there, to let them rest in stone and history. But when she reached the last letter, the one that had arrived days after the news of Arthur's disappearance, something in her stopped. The words still shimmered with life. "If I don't return, tell our child I loved them before I ever saw their face, and tell you I was never afraid because I was loved." Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed the page to her chest and made a different decision. Instead of sending the entire box, Emily carefully placed that final letter into a new envelope and addressed it to a French organization she had read about, a small non-profit that collected stories of missing soldiers, hoping to reunite families with those lost between borders and battles. She sealed the letter with a trembling hand. Weeks later, across the channel in France, nurse Hélène Moreau was sorting through a growing pile of letters in the back office of the same organization. She had volunteered her time after the war, hoping to help others find the peace she had once found beside the man still known only as Jacques. She opened envelope after envelope, reading the names, the places, the sorrowful goodbyes, until one caught her eye. The handwriting was careful, delicate. As she read, her heart began to pound. The letter spoke of a downed aircraft in Normandy, of a child due in December, of a man who promised to return. And then she saw it, the name Emily. Hélène stood frozen for a moment, the room spinning around her. She didn't wait. She didn't even pause to gather her thoughts. With the letter clutched to her chest, she rushed through the hospital corridors, her footsteps echoing with urgency. She burst into the quiet ward, where Jacques sat by the window, lost in the fading afternoon light. She knelt beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think this is for you." She placed the letter gently in his hands and held her breath, because deep inside, something told her. This was the moment the wind would change. The room was quiet, almost sacred, as the letter rested in his hands. The paper, fragile and yellowed by time, seemed to carry more weight than anything he had held before. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it, the air thick with something unspoken. Hélène stood close by, watching with a heart caught between hope and fear. He began to read, word by word, slowly, as if each syllable reached down into the forgotten corners of his mind. His lips moved softly, whispering fragments aloud, letting the words settle like rain on dry soil. And then it came. Emily. His voice broke. The name escaped his mouth not as a question, but as a memory, one that struck. Like lightning, his eyes widened, and his hands let the letter fall to the floor. He staggered back, gripping the side of the bed, breath caught in his throat. Tears welled up before he could stop them. His knees gave way, and he dropped to the ground, covering his face with his hands, as if trying to hold together everything that had just come crashing back. I'm Arthur," he whispered. It wasn't loud, but in that room it echoed like thunder. Images flooded in, flashes of the sky above. Normandy, the shattering sound of flak hitting the wing, the feeling of falling, then darkness, pain, silence, and a voice always calling from somewhere far away. Emily. The name wasn't just a word anymore, it was home. Helene knelt beside him, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. She held him tightly, not like a nurse comforting a patient, but like someone anchoring a soul that had just returned from the edge of nowhere. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You found your way back." In the days that followed, Arthur barely slept. He asked questions, wrote down every scrap of memory that resurfaced. He moved slowly but with purpose, as if he were learning to live again. Then one morning, he asked for a mirror. Helene brought it to him in silence. Arthur stared at his reflection. His face was worn, lined by time and pain. Grey streaked his hair. The man who had once danced with clouds now leaned on a cane to steady himself. But behind the tired eyes, he saw something familiar. The pilot, the husband, the promise, the man who said he would come back. And in that moment, Arthur Bell smiled, not because he had found himself, but because he had found his way home. The train rattled softly as it made its way through the French countryside, each turn of the wheels bringing Arthur Bell closer to a life he wasn't sure still existed. The sky was pale, clouds drifting low, and Arthur sat in silence, gazing out the window with hands folded on his lap. The cane rested by his side, and in the pocket of his coat was the golden RAF button that had once identified him to the world, proof of who he had been, even when he could no longer remember. Beside him sat Helene Moreau, the nurse who had done more than tend to his wounds. She had pieced him back together. She had given him the letter, and with it, his name, his past, his heart. Now she was giving him something even greater, the chance to return. The Red Cross had arranged it all. After confirming his identity, after learning of the woman who had waited, after months of paperwork and uncertainty, the path home had opened. But as Arthur sat there, his thoughts raced with questions he couldn't shake. Would Emily still remember him? Would she still want him? Had she moved on like so many were told they should? A man missing for years, a pilot presumed lost, a shadow from another life. What right did he have to ask for a place in her world again? In London, the city had changed. Buildings stood patched and weary. Streets were busier now, filled with people trying to live again. And in a modest home tucked in a quiet neighborhood, Emily folded linens in the sitting room, unaware of what that day would bring. The house was filled with the gentle noise of everyday life, a kettle humming in the kitchen, the soft footsteps of a child moving from room to room. Lily, now a bright and curious 2-year-old, was sprawled on the rug, humming to herself as she played with a small wooden horse Arthur had carved before the war. For Emily, the war had ended on paper, but not in her heart. Her mind still lived in memories, in waiting, in that fragile space between acceptance and hope. She had almost given the letters away once, almost closed that chapter, but something deep and quiet, had stopped her. Then the doorbell rang. It was a simple sound, ordinary, but in that moment it rang like thunder. Emily rose, smoothing her skirt, her heart skipping for reasons she couldn't name. Lily ran after her, holding a toy in one hand. Together, they moved to the front door, Emily adjusting her sweater, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. She opened it, and time stopped. A man stood there, tall but slightly stooped, silver hair tousled by the breeze, a cane supporting his step. His coat was worn, His face was marked by time and war, but his eyes, those eyes, looked at her with a softness that shattered everything she thought she had prepared herself for. The box of letters she had carried slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Envelopes spilled out across the entryway, their faded ink catching the afternoon light. Lily clung to her mother's leg, peeking out from behind the fabric. The man opened his mouth. His voice was low, careful, as if afraid to speak the words too soon. Emily. She didn't answer with words. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She stepped forward, covering her mouth with one hand, eyes brimming with tears. And then she was in his arms, burying her face into the shoulder she had dreamed of for so long. Her sobs came in waves, years of silence, fear, longing, all pouring out in one embrace. Arthur dropped his cane and held her tightly, his arms trembling, not from weakness but from the overwhelming flood of memory and emotion. Lily, confused but unafraid, stepped closer. Her small hand reached up and touched Arthur's arm. "Mommy, who is he?" she asked softly. Emily knelt down, still crying, and pulled Lily into the embrace. She pressed her forehead to Arthur's, her voice barely a whisper. "He's your father, sweetheart. He came home." Arthur knelt too, tears falling freely now. He looked at Lily, at the tiny face that held his eyes, and smiled through the storm inside him. And in that quiet moment, on an ordinary street in post-war London, a family was made whole again. Neighbors would speak of it in hushed tones later. The gray-haired man with the pilot's eyes, the woman who never stopped believing, the little girl who reached for a stranger and found her father. But to them it wasn't a story. It was a promise fulfilled. It was love, crossing time, war, and silence, finding its way home. The living room was quiet that morning, bathed in the soft light of a sky that had finally learned to be kind again. Arthur, still adjusting to the rhythm of a life he thought he'd lost forever, sat on the edge of the armchair, his cane leaning against the wall. Across from him stood Lily, small, bright-eyed and curious. She tilted her head as children do when trying to understand something their hearts already know. Arthur slowly lowered himself to one knee, every movement a careful effort. His eyes, misted with emotion, met hers without a single word. She took a small step forward and reached out with one hand, placing her tiny fingers gently against his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, but it landed like thunder in his soul. "Are you the daddy from the sky?" she asked. Arthur couldn't speak. His throat closed around the answer. All he could do was nod as tears filled his eyes and spilled down his face. He gathered Lily into his arms, holding her like the world might vanish again if he let go. And in that moment, everything he had lost, the years, the voice, the memories, were replaced with something even more powerful. He was home. In the days that followed, the neighbors quietly watched the miracle unfold. No one said much, but they noticed. The man with the silver hair and the weathered face, once thought gone forever, now walked the garden path each morning, his daughter clinging to his side. Laughter returned to the small house. Light danced again through the curtains. Emily and Arthur sat together each night, fingers intertwined, sharing stories that once lived only in their dreams. They spoke of letters and skies, of lullabies left unsung, of moments stolen by silence. They cried, they laughed, and above all, they healed. And across the sea, in a modest hospital now turned into a shelter, Hélène Moreau received a small envelope. Inside was a letter written in Emily's hand, graceful, heartfelt, full of gratitude. With it was a single flower, pressed flat between the pages, a wild daisy, simple and lovely. Hélène held it gently, her heart full. She placed the letter in her diary, beside the entry she had written the day Arthur first spoke his name. That diary remained by her bedside, a quiet reminder that even in war, in loss, in forgotten names and broken minds, love could still find its way. And for Arthur Bell, once lost to the wind, now cradled in the arms of his family, it was not just a return. It was a rebirth. One soft touch from a child, one whispered name, and the sky he had once flown through became the place he had finally landed. Home. Arthur and Emily's story is not just about letters or war, or even about waiting. It's about something far deeper, something that still echoes in the hearts of those who've ever loved. Someone across distance, across time, across silence. Years after the war had faded into history books, after the uniforms were folded and medals placed in drawers, Lily found that old wooden box in the attic. Dusty, worn by time, but untouched in its meaning. Inside were dozens of yellowed envelopes, carefully tied with a ribbon that once held back her mother's hair. Each letter opened a window into a world she had never seen, a love she had never lived, but one that had given her life. She read every word as if they were being spoken aloud by the father she had once thought was just a photograph on the mantel. She could feel the ache in his promises, the longing in his words, the bravery between the lines. And when she reached the final letter, the one he never had the chance to send, she cried. Not out of sadness, but because somehow, even through the fog of war and the cruelty of time, love had won. Moved by the story, Lily published the letters in a book titled Letters for Emily. What started as a daughter's tribute became a symbol of hope for millions. Schools taught it, soldiers carried it in their bags, and strangers wrote to say how it reminded them of someone they had lost or someone they were still waiting for. But perhaps the most powerful part of this story isn't the letters themselves. It's what they stood for. Memory, sacrifice, legacy. Arthur wasn't just a pilot. He was a husband who kept a promise, even when the world believed he was gone. Emily wasn't just a wife. She was a light in the darkness, holding on to love when everyone else had let go. And Lily, she was the living proof that hope, no matter how small, can shape the future. Their story reminds us that behind every uniform, every mission, and every farewell at the train station, there is a human soul longing to return home. A soul that laughs, dreams, writes, and waits. A soul that fights, not only on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when fear knocks and faith whispers, "Hold on, just a little longer." Arthur's final resting place lies beside the woman who believed in him when no one else did. No statues, no fanfare. Just two names carved into stone and a single sentence that says everything. He promised he would come back, and he did. And maybe that's the most heroic thing of all, to keep your word, to keep your love alive, even when the world tries to bury it. As you close this chapter, ask yourself, did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories of courage, loyalty, and love should be told? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. This community exists to honor stories like Arthur's, stories that would otherwise be forgotten in dusty boxes and fading memories. Let the images linger, a young couple embracing at a train station under a grey sky, a pilot alone in the cockpit clutching a photo of his wife, a nurse in a quiet tent reading a letter aloud to a man who doesn't remember his name, and finally a woman opening her front door and finding not a ghost but a promise fulfilled. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Stories of real people, real hearts, and the silent heroes who still live on through the ones who remember. Because in the end, Some battles are won not with weapons, but with words. Not in the skies or the trenches, but in the soul. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply finding your way back home.